Trackmania is a nearly 20-year-old franchise developed by a French company called Nadeo, which is owned and published by Ubisoft. Unlike a lot of your more stereotypical Ubisoft titles, Nadeo never really bothered to advertise their games outside of French-speaking countries. It's been big in Europe for a long time now, but it's only started to pick up steam in the US over the past couple years. As you can see from the footage playing in the background, it's a racing game, but it's not like your more traditional racers like Forza or Gran Turismo. The technical term is arcade racer, but I personally like to describe it as mini golf for cars. There's speed boosters, loop-to-loops, and all manner of blocks that affect your car in different ways. What's more is that the tracks I've been showing you up until this point, those are just from the seasonal campaigns the developers made themselves. The things this community creates, they're out of this world. Trackmania supports customizing just about everything you can think of, from objects made in Blender and even the textures on each block. In just the past couple months, I've seen tracks inspired by the Iron Giant, Howl's Moving Castle, World of Warcraft, and, I shit you not, someone made a mini golf track. The possibilities are practically limitless, and while I have been captivated from the moment I discovered this game, nothing could have prepared me for just how cool the esports scene is.
It's going to be an awkward line for Wosa. It's going to be safe.
Whoa,
but
the flip from Scrappy!
She's going. The ace is on for Sprout. They've done it.
Est-ce que Otak peut le faire? Otak a plus de vitesse, il est premier. C'est Otak qui est le premier qualifié en finale de World Cup Trackmania.
Mudda is going to go for the more speed. Whoever gets it best here wins, and Mudda will have
Oh,
so
they're
many
gonna be
more
neck and neck. Who gets
Mudda
there?
takes
It's so
it.
close. We can't see points. 6,000 of a second, and Mudda wins the TMGL Grand League.
There's a lot to unpack here, and I'd be lying if I said I could give you a comprehensive history of Trackmania Esports. I've really only been playing the game since late 2021, and I've been following the esports scene for just about as long. While I have done a lot of research on how it used to be, there are definitely better sources if you want a full retrospective. The gist of what you should take away is that the Trackmania scene is grassroots to its very core. The devs were around to some extent back in the day, but for the most part they were pretty hands-off until around like 2016-ish. That leaves a pretty big gap in time where the community was left to its own devices. There were a few random large tournaments in the very early days, but for the most part Trackmania tournaments were extremely small. While games like Dota 2 were breaking records with multi-million-dollar prize pools, Trackmania Esports was sometimes struggling to even break past the 5-figure range. Without anyone to dictate what should and shouldn't be important to the Trackmania crowd, the community itself decided which tournaments they placed the most significance on. Some of the more notable ones would be the Gamers Assembly events for each of the specific styles of racing like tech and full speed. Even DreamHack used to host tournaments back when, but the tournaments that stuck out the most, no matter who I talked to, they always had the same two answers: the World Cup and the ZrT Cup. ZrT is a French content creator that, from what I can tell, is an absolute icon in the French Trackmania scene. He's a big streamer, he's casted a ton of big events, he's managed teams, and of course, he's put on his own events. The prize pools were never massive, usually only a few $1,000s, but the ZrT Cups were always more about the spectacle. You see, ZrT would make some of the worst maps imaginable and then invite the pros to duke it out. Something about the best players in the world racing on what are ostensibly awful maps is just so damn entertaining. It's a complete clown fiesta in the best way possible, and don't even get me started on the live audience. The context for this clip is that the pros have to drive over a block that turns off their engine until they cross the next checkpoint. ZrT gets the audience to participate and, well, see for yourself.
Cette usine dans laquelle il faut absolument... Et voilà! What qui est ressorti?
That is well over 10,000 people packed into an arena in France, and one of the coolest things I've ever seen. It's a perfect example of how devoted the Trackmania scene is. But if you want to see how they treat a more serious tournament, the Trackmania World Cup has existed in one form or another for a long time now. The earliest records I could find date back to 2006. Ownership of the tournament itself has passed through a few hands over the years until it eventually fell into Nadeo's lap around the mid-2010s. Despite there being quite a few tournaments that have rivaled or even eclipsed its prize pool, the World Cup was always and still remains one of the most significant titles in the world of Trackmania Esports. The The community latched onto this one competition and collectively decided it was more important than your average event. This is their end-all, be-all tournament, the one that matters just a little bit more than everything else. And as you can imagine, the few who've claimed a title for themselves are held in really high regard. Thankfully for the community, Nadeo has put a lot of effort into keeping the sanctity of the World Cup as intact as much as possible. They could have just as easily changed how things work to appease their corporate overlords, but the basics of the events have remained more or less the same for about a decade at this point. Players from all around the world compete to qualify for a group stage, the top players from groups move on to a final round, and the winner is crowned the world champion for that year. A few minor tweaks to the format here and there, but for the most part, Nadeo seems to understand they have a good thing going. So much so that they've recently changed their entire franchise system to work around the World Cup itself. Now, I've never been one for franchise esports leagues. It feels disingenuous to the efforts of the community to build itself up, especially when you realize that two of the biggest esports in the world, CSGO and Dota 2, were essentially grassroots with some help from Valve occasionally, so it's definitely not necessary to succeed. Regardless of that, Nadeo has been running their own franchise league for a few years now. Tier 1 is called the Grand League, or TMGL for short, and Tier 2 is the Challenger League, or TMCL, which is the highest non-franchise level players can qualify into. They used to have the Open League for Tier 3 as well, but they got rid of that when they decided to focus everything around the World Cup. Being that the devs run both the World Cup and the franchise Grand League, they could have just as easily said that only the teams and orgs that pay for their franchise spots are allowed to compete in the World Cup. I think we all know a few companies that would probably try something like that. While the TMGL orgs are essentially locked in for the World Cup, they aren't the only ones who get to fight for glory. I won't go through the whole system, but the gist of it is that the qualifiers for the World Cup are based on points. Simply competing in Tiers 1 and 2 will net teams the most points, obviously, but Nadeo also puts on regional events over the course of the year for Tier 3 teams to earn points. And not only that, but your rating in matchmaking of all things can actually yield some points if you grind out at the higher end of the ranked ladder. The only barrier to entry for this is that you have to purchase the $30 annual pass to the game, but to be honest, literally everyone at that level of play already has it. Hell, even I pay for that. As of right now, this is the first year of the World Tour circuit, so I can't fully judge the execution of everything, but thus far they've done a really good job. The devs have even contracted a few reputable community members to run operations for the regional tournaments, and the quality really shows in the end product. It's not just a way to make a quick buck for Nadeo, they've actually gone the extra mile to build on the foundations of the community alongside the people in it. And it's such a bittersweet thing to witness, because I wish more esports devs and publishers understood that concept. If it wasn't obvious enough already, I love the way Trackmania runs their esports scene. And while I'm definitely not blind to a lot of the criticisms about it, you gotta realize that I'm coming from nearly half a decade of experience in the Overwatch scene, and let me tell you, things are way worse off over there. So I definitely don't take for granted all of the cool things Trackmania does. And even then, I do agree with some of the complaints against the World Tour circuit. Identities come to mind. But here's the thing, if you don't like it, you're allowed to go somewhere else. Most of the time when game devs franchise their esport, it's borderline impossible to run third-party events. I actually released a video about this topic for the Overwatch scene around this time last year, but that's just not the case with Trackmania. If I wanted to host a $100,000 tournament tomorrow, nothing's standing in my way. Well, besides logistics and marketing, but you get the idea. Nadeo doesn't stand in the way of competition in their own esports scene, and in fact, they usually go out of their way to sponsor big events. Imagine if a tournament for a Blizzard or Riot game wanted to have a prize pool bigger than the Overwatch League or Valorant's World Championship. Their lawyers would shut that down faster than you could say Monopoly, and that's what I love so much about this esport. It's just cool. Everything about it is really well done, and Nadeo has done a great job in making sure their community comes first. And if anyone at Nadeo happens to be watching this, you've got a really good thing going here. Don't fuck it up. Well, I hope you found this video entertaining at the very least, and maybe I convinced you to try Trackmania for yourself. The game just recently came to Steam and is supposed to be coming out on consoles at some point this year. Obviously I'd recommend it, but maybe start with the free version first and then go to the paid tiers if you really enjoy it. Anyways, like the video if you did, subscribe if you wanna, and until next time, don't die.